What's up, y'all? This is Wheezy. If you enjoy this content, please remember to rate and review. Ever since getting banned on Google, it has been a true headache to get back up and rolling. So please share with like-minded friends, rate and review, and enjoy the show. Can't thank y'all enough. Much love.
And now is a time when things are shifting. There's going to be a new world order out there.
My fellow Americans, I've said on several occasions that I wouldn't comment about the recent congressional hearings on the Iran-Contra matter.
All right, y'all. What's up? Welcome, everyone, to the What is Truth podcast. I'm your host, Wheezy. I am joined today by the lovely Dr. Judith Curry. How are you, Doctor?
Oh, I'm just fine. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for coming on. I've been going down this, what I would call, rabbit hole. Not too long, but I've been genuinely curious into it. I grew up, I guess you can say, indoctrinated by the mainstream and through the school system, and maybe I was all out hippie, and I still care about the environment. But once you start seeing things not adding up, you come up with questions, and I started going down that path, and your name kept coming up and coming up and coming up, and I'm grateful that you gave me a copy of your book. You've written a few books on the subject, but before we get any further, if you could give us a little bit of background of all your work, how you got into this, and so on and so forth.
Okay, well, I got my PhD in 1982 in geophysical sciences, focusing on atmospheric science and climate of the Arctic, and I remained in university faculty position until 2017, and I conducted research on a variety of topics. A couple of turning points that sort of changed my path a bit. In 2005, I co-authored a paper on hurricanes that got a lot of attention because it was published right after Hurricane Katrina. And it was very controversial, and there's a huge amount of media attention because people were so hypersensitive about Hurricane Katrina and hurricane intensity. And so this sort of inadvertently pushed me into the public debate on climate change. And at the time, I thought that the responsible thing to do was, in my public statements, was to support, the UN consensus on climate change from the IPCC. I had concerns about what they were doing, including insufficient attention to uncertainty, and it seemed like a lot of their people were activists and advocates, which I didn't think was mixing too well with the science, but, I felt it was the responsible thing to do. And that all changed in November of 2009 with the unauthorized release of the so-called ClimateGate emails. I don't know if you've heard of that. From the University of East Anglia, it included a lot of email traffic from IPCC authors. And it revealed a lot of skullduggery. I'm trying to get editors fired for publishing papers that they didn't like, and trying to withhold data from people, who they thought might be critical of their work, and they were overconfident, and they were overall misbehaving, and by my standards. And I spoke out about this, saying, look, we need to do better. We need to make our data publicly available. We need to be transparent about our methods. We need to pay more attention to uncertainty and be honest about the uncertainties. And when somebody disagrees with us, we need to be respectful and try to understand their argument and see if there's any merit, rather than dismissing them and attacking them for no particular reason. So, it seems like motherhood and apple pie kind of statements, but the establishment and my colleagues didn't like this at all. Thou shalt not criticize important climate people. And this began a not so slow process of ostracizing me, and trying to cancel me from the community. In 2011, they figured that, well, the best way to deal with me is just to call me a denier. And that pushes me into the camp of all the crazies, and then people will ignore me. And so, so I started to see the writing on the wall that, the university and this whole environment was not the place for me. So in 2017, I left the university and went full-time with my company, Climate Forecast Applications Network. And, my company, it's a weather and climate service company, and we work to help our clients deal with their weather and climate related risks. So this brought me to a more practical side of the whole issue. So I have, one foot in research and scholarship and another foot in very applied things, helping people make decisions. And my most recent book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, it was just published in June, sort of synthesizes everything that I've learned about. It's not so much science, but it's about the process of science, how politics and science can be a really bad mix, and talking about how to what kind of information people need to make decisions. It's not the stuff that the climate models are spewing out. People need really different types of information, and how we can, think about climate risks and how we can think about managing them. So that's sort of where I'm at. And it's hard to believe that I'm regarded as a controversial person, because I think I'm a grandmother. I'm full of common sense. Why am I controversial? But nevertheless, I seem to be.
Well, unfortunately, that's the age we're living in, where if you speak against a certain narrative, the consensus, in quotation marks, you get held as an outcast, you get canceled, and that seems to be the way things are going. I think during the whole COVID era, I think that has kind of made people take a double take in science. I know it did for me. I grew up, regarding science as the truth, the ultimate truth, the way to get into the truth. And especially seeing all the shenanigans that happened during COVID, I was like, man, there's a huge difference between science and the science. When you hear quotes from people like Dr. Fauci, who said before that if you question Dr. Fauci, you are questioning science itself. That is one of the most unscientific things I have ever heard. And when you see this over and over again, and you see instances of junk science where corporations are involved, big money is involved, influencing these studies, it definitely shatters your trust in science. But having said all that, it's not like I don't believe in science anymore. I still do. It's just when you don't see the scientific method being employed properly, where any type of criticism is being censored. It does make you raise your eyebrows. How do you feel about that? Do you feel there's a crisis in science, Dr. Judy?
Okay, well, we've lost. Science is really a process, okay, for trying to understand the world. And, we never achieve complete understanding about pretty much anything. So it's really a process. There are people who try to speak of the science as some sort of canon or dogma, and whenever that's going on, there's a lot of politics behind it. They're pushing some sort of political agenda. So, we've gotten, for science that's socially relevant, and COVID-related science and climate science are certainly two prime examples. You see that there's a lot of politics involved in that. And, people get canceled for, speaking out, raising issues of uncertainty and disagreeing, which is totally wrong. And this is infiltrated into the universities. So it's not just like in Washington, D.C. and politics, whatever, but this has infiltrated the universities. And the universities are, I don't know what to say about the universities anymore. It's become extremely politically correct. Activists have sort of taken control of the universities, and just all these, I don't know, it's not a good situation.
Well, do you see any, when you go deeper into that whole education, I'm a big history nerd, and you see the Rockefeller influences into the education system, and you see the Club of Rome putting out that book from 1972. What was it? The Limits of Growth. Yeah, just and you see how it's all tied to eugenics. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's all tied, but they use more fear tactics, and this is where we get this climate hysteria coming into the mix. It seems like just a big tool for more power grab. From my perspective, I don't know how you feel about that, Doctor.
Yeah, well, there's two worldviews in play. One is sort of that humans are trespassing on the planet, and they want degrowth and anti-capitalism, and the only way we can get there is to be, anti-democratic. And, so there's a worldview like that. And then there's another worldview that wants freedom and wants to move forward and advance. So it's just a big clash. And okay, what's behind it? Basic personality types, education, culture, politics, who knows what drives these two worldviews. Unfortunately, the worldview, the sort of the degrowth worldview is rampant in the universities. So that's not a good thing. So, it's just, it's hard to know, but I think, it's hard to know how all this plays out, but, nature's going to do what nature's going to do. And people are going to fight against tyranny as much as they can. The situation over in Europe is really not good with all this green dogma. I mean, it's just insane. I mean, they're trying to break up corporations, the Netherlands has all these lawsuits to break up corporations, break up banks, because they're funding things that they don't view as green. How anybody thinks that solar and wind power are green and renewable, that's a joke, because they're a real blight on the planet, in my opinion. So we're just stuck with things that simply don't make sense. And it's hard to see how we get out of this, but nature's going to take forward, and there's no way we're going to reach net zero by 2050. So we just need to sit back and watch this play out.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And if you go back a few decades with several people making bombastic predictions that the world is going to end, and they're continually wrong. I just keep thinking about it. It just, if you tell someone that believes in science that they're very dogmatic, very religious, they'll scoff at you. What are you talking about? We're complete opposite to that. But you see a lot of these similarities to religious stuff. You hear some religions talking about the end of the world, and then you hear these guys talking about the planet is going to end, and it's just another fear tactic. The similarities, to me at least, seem uncanny.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's the science. It's very analogous to religious dogma. You've got heretics and, the whole works.
Yeah. And like the predictions of Paul Ehrlich being continuously wrong decade after decade. And yet he's still paraded and celebrated as a great figure. It's mind-boggling, to say the least.
I know they've been trotting him out more recently. I can't believe it.
What are your thoughts when you see something like that, like that example of Mr. Ehrlich?
Well, common sense has left the room. I mean, it's been like that for a while. And, at some point, people are figuring, that this whole climate crisis is an insufficient crisis when people don't have enough food or enough energy, So I think people are going to start to realize that. And there's so many battles over land use trying to get permitting for transmission lines and wind farms and solar farms. I mean, people don't want them, anywhere near. I mean, they change the microclimate, they hurt birds and insects, and you end up with unreliable and expensive electricity. What's not to hate?
Yeah, that's one of the fascinating things. Like I mentioned earlier, when I first started exploring this, my mind was conflating climate change and pollution as one thing. That was the hardest. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand. It may sound simple and like you're an idiot, but I couldn't I was conflating it. And so when I heard people speaking, about climate change, not being a big of a deal, I'm like, what are you talking about? Don't you want to save the earth? I couldn't grasp it. And it took me many years to break that mental barrier. And
that was planned to confuse people, that CO2 emissions are pollution. I mean, we need to pay more attention to real pollution, polluting the air and the water with particulates and bad chemicals and whatever. I mean, we need to pay attention to that. CO2, I mean, we don't want to endlessly dump CO2 into the atmosphere, but until we have, better ways of producing energy and whatever, I mean, nuclear is like the obvious answer. I mean, we need to keep burning fossil fuels for now. I mean, yeah, we can, work to transition. Let's envision a 21st century energy infrastructure that's way better than what we have right now. Fantastic. But don't talk about these crazy deadlines that we have to meet, and therefore we need to massively deploy wind and solar because that's what we have right now. I mean, this is a huge step backward. That's doing all sorts of harm to economies, to the environment, and it's an opportunity cost because we're wasting money on that. We're not spending money on, real solutions to our problems.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I've been digesting a few books that are in similar nature. I started reading yours. Unfortunately, due to the nature of work that I do, the easiest way for me to consume a book is through audio. It's just, I've been working 14, 15, 16-hour days. So to try to set apart a little bit of time to read a few pages. It's very hard, but I did get it through a couple of your chapters of your recent book. But one of the things that I've been seeing is, and it makes complete sense, is how very often we hear this apocalyptic version of the world ending because of us and the CO2 emissions, and very rarely do cold weather deaths that dwarf, the hot weather deaths, and all these other figures. They get swept under the rug. Let's just shine a spotlight on this particular area, but let's completely ignore this other area. And you brought up cost. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Go back to like 1992 when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was formed, and there was a 1992 treaty, and this treaty was focused on preventing dangerous human-caused climate change by reducing emissions. This was in 1992, before there was any sign of human-caused warming, and before we had any idea whether warming was good or bad, and before we had any idea about how we might deal with this situation if it turned out to be bad. Nevertheless, they already had a solution. Okay, we're going to stop emitting fossil fuels. Okay, so this was, a clear political agenda that, we're faced with. And so again, the focus, so the scientists in the UN assessment reports were told to focus on dangerous human-caused climate change. Forget natural variability, natural climate variability. Forget about any benefits from global warming. Just focus on the dangers of human-caused warming. So the whole problem got put into this little tiny box, when there's a whole big space out there. I mean, you mentioned, deaths from cold. Well, there's 9 times globally, there's 9 times as many deaths from cold as there are from heat extremes. And this has been repeated, in all sorts of different countries and geographies and climate. I mean, that cold kills more people than the heat does. So, I mean, if we're warming, and one of the key conclusions of the latest UN climate assessment was, that heat extremes are becoming more likely and extreme cold is becoming less likely. Well, that's good because it's going to reduce overall mortality, but you don't, from weather extreme, but you don't see that pointed out. So it's just, it's politics all the way down here.
Yeah, politics, corruption. I don't know if you saw this, but a few months ago, it was going on Twitter where supposedly the video was taken in China, and they had a football field worth of electric vehicles, just sitting there, brand new. And apparently they couldn't get rid of them. They had to sell something for a quota, but then nothing ever happened. They just kept them there in the parking lot because they can't dispose of them because of the lithium. And this is all going green. Everybody wants to get their electrical vehicle, but very rarely do people think, okay, where did this lithium come from? In many cases, child labor, exploitation. So you have this warped view that you get fed that going green is a good thing. It's good for the environment, and you're doing the responsible thing, but there's such a dark side behind it.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with green, but what they're talking about isn't very green. Okay, wind and solar, I don't regard as green. Okay, a lot of the mining that has to be done to support all this is really pretty dreadful. Okay, there's lithium all over the place, but we only do it in China and Africa and a few places like that, where they have essentially slave labor, and nobody really cares about the environment.
Yeah.
So, it's nobody's doing a full, see, it's the urgency, all these deadlines, code red, and, we're on the way to hell, or whatever the UN General Secretary, his latest little word bite is. But it's this urgency that causes us to make bad choices and bad decisions. So, if we could, slowly let these things develop and do a learning curve, and we can do a full life cycle assessment and figure out what the unintended consequences of all these things are. If we do slowly, then we can make better decisions. But when we're, all this urgency and these mandates, then we end up making bad decisions.
And it's an unfalsifiable hypothesis. I mean, when you constantly hear, even with the myocarditis upticks happening, that a lot of people that were skeptical in the vaccines were saying it's probably the vaccines. We saw articles come out, it's probably because of climate change that we're seeing an uptick. And so anytime something is going bad, let's just blame climate change. It's done over, it's overdone. And
that it deflects from our real problems. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
First off, there's a lot of natural weather variability, weather extremes. They've always happened, they're happening now, and they'll continue to happen in the future, no matter what we do with CO2. In the US, the weather was much worse in the 1930s. Worse heat waves, worse droughts, worse forest fires, even the worst US landfalling hurricanes. Much worse than anything we've seen in the 21st century. Did that have anything to do with CO2? No, not at all. So it just, I lost my train of thought. Is there something that you just said and that I didn't answer, but I lost my train of thought?
About the unfalsifiable hypothesis,
Oh, okay. We understand that, CO2 emissions act in the direction of warming the planet. The magnitude is uncertain. To the extent to whether it exceeds natural climate variability. There's a lot of debate about that. Like this big spike that we're seeing right now, that's natural climate variability. It's related to decreasing clouds. It has nothing to do with CO2. So that there's a lot of complexity in the system, and then everybody just says, oh, climate change. And that means we don't have to think. We don't have to do the hard work of trying to understand what's going on. We don't have to do the hard work of trying to manage all this. We can blame all of our poor choices about land use and bad governance and bad resource use and this, that, and the other. When something bad happens, we just blame climate change rather than trying to address the root problems that relate to our infrastructure, our governance, our land use, whatever.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I live in Florida, and we get this thing that happens yearly. I don't know if you've heard of the term red tide out here on the West Coast. And I've been reading quite a bit about it, trying to find out, and there seems like there's a lot of junk science going there. And the most reasonable explanation is that it's whenever they release those fertilizer dumps from Lake Okeechobee into the Gulf. And you constantly see these papers that I'm assuming, I don't have any proof, but I'm assuming are paid by Big Sugar. Oh no, we don't really know what's going on. It's up for debate, blah, blah, blah. And it's infuriating as someone that I do love the environment. I don't believe in polluting. And I often think about, if you or I were to go to the Gulf and just for the hell of it, kill some manatees and dolphins, we would go to prison, and rightfully so. And yet when these big sugar companies are dumping all this crap into the ocean, actually polluting and killing literally 200 tons of marine life whenever these red tides get out of hand. And not a slap on the wrist, nothing, maybe a couple fines here and there. You see the hypocrisy, and that is so infuriating. I mean, you throw a piece of trash on the beach, you face some serious fines, but these other companies, during the BP oil spill, it just slaps on the wrist that we see over and over again. And that extends even into the banking system, as we saw. I don't know if you paid attention to the Jeff Epstein, Morgan Chase deal. It just slaps on the wrist over and over. I don't know. How do you feel about that, Dr. Judy?
Well, this whole red tide issue, I mean, it's definitely tied to the release of fertilizer into the Gulf. I mean, I don't question that at all. But I thought that Governor DeSantis was trying to do something about that. Maybe not. I guess he's got his hands full with other things. But I read something where he was trying to figure out how to deal with that. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, that is flat out dumping of fertilizer into the Gulf. I mean, there's no
it only makes sense because you get, the reason it's called red tide, you get inundated with red algae. And all that algae does is suck out all the oxygen and nutrients from, and essentially suffocating the sea life. And when that happens, all those dead fish on the shores, you can't even walk on the beach. It's just nothing but carcasses. And even if you're a worker, you're working at a little restaurant on the beach, I can't think inhaling that toxic air is any good for you. And again, nothing really happens to the real polluters. But this is, I guess, what I was trying to get at is it's almost, it would be comical if it wasn't sad that we, the average Joe, gets blamed for polluting the earth. But in reality, it's these big corporations, these big sugars, these big oils that are the biggest polluters on the planet, and they face no repercussions. Every now and then they'll get hit with a fine, which is like $2, the equivalent to $2 for you and I, but it makes the headlines every now and then to look, we're actually doing something. But it all seems like a facade, at least for me.
Yeah, well, we've lost the plot. Nobody pays attention to real pollution anymore. It's all climate change.
Yeah. It's do you, as you see this, and you mentioned how unfortunately the universities with this woke ideology infiltrating and for lack of a better term, being a cancer to our kids, spreading. Do you see any hope through this as far as the new generation maybe snapping out of it, or what are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think there's a little bit of backlash at the universities, against that. There was so much cancel culture on the universities, where students were allowed to get rid of faculty members and administrators they didn't like for some reason. Invited speakers were canceled because somebody was concerned about what they might say or what they had said in the past, and on it goes. And just this whole culture is terrible. But I think there's a growing backlash against us at many universities. So I hope things are going in the right direction. But the thing about, I see two threads in the newer generation, the 20-somethings, the ones are just, they're depressed and they're afraid about the environment and all of this apocalyptic rhetoric, and they think we'll all be dead by 1930, and they're genuinely depressed, with all this stupidity that's going on. And then the others who don't really have, the context that the older people have seen, they just say, so, what is this? This makes no sense. So I see two threads, and both threads diverge from the party line, if you will. That's about control. I mean, there's a lot of desire for control of many aspects of society. I mean, the EU is just beyond crazy in this regard. And, you know, I see this country trying to go in that direction, but there's a lot of, it's pretty hard to pull off in this country. But, you know, I don't know. People, you know, education isn't really the answer, because there's some very smart people with some wacko ideas. I mean, that just really have this worldview, you know, this degrowth kind of worldview that I think is really pernicious. So, you know, it's just the way the world is. I mean, the best thing to me that we can do is, you know, acknowledge disagreement. You know, we all need to acknowledge disagreement, and there's different ways of looking at this. And we need to abandon any pretense that we can control pandemics or the climate or any of these extremely complex societal problems. We need to seek to better understand them and to figure out how to manage the impacts. And that's a major theme of my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, how to think about risk and how to manage it.
Yeah, that's you have to look for the positivity when during these uncertain times. And yeah, I go maybe I go I go pretty back deep in history, and you start seeing patterns. I mean, you start to see these things at play. You know, I did mention the book by the Club of Rome, The Limits of Growth. Mm-hmm. Tied into it, and it's just it all comes down to a power grab, it seems. I mean, even this COVID stuff that we went through. I've said it before, but here in Florida, I was a bit nervous at first. I'm not gonna. Oh yeah, I knew all along it was all nonsense. No, I was a bit nervous the first couple of weeks, but I live in Venice, Florida, where the median age is 69 years old.
Oh.
That's the median age, one of the oldest towns in the nation. And after a few weeks, I wasn't seeing piles of dead people everywhere. And people were walking around with no masks. And tourists were still coming here. It's the shark's tooth capital of the world, Venice, Florida is. And I was like, hey, wait a minute. If I just paid attention to what the TV was spewing, you were thinking that we were in the new age of the Black Plague. You know, it had made a comeback. But my reality was completely different from what I was seeing on the TV. And whenever I have these little online debates with folks, I bring up my town. I go, how come none of this happened? How come our hospitals weren't jam-packed? None of the stuff that you had seen. Did just COVID happen to, you know what, we're going to skip Venice. But I guess it sounds hilarious, you know, to make that analogy. But when you look back at some of the stuff that we're pulling through, oh yeah, you got to wear a mask. But if you eat, you can lower it down and COVID's not going to attack you. I mean, some of the most ridiculous stuff.
Oh, and worse yet, with the Black Lives Matter thing, well, that's important. You can go ahead and congregate and do that, yeah. You know, because that's an important issue.
COVID pick and chose, you know, yeah, where and when it was going to attack.
I know. I mean, the early variants of COVID were quite potent and scary. And in the early days, yeah, I have in my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, I have a number of chapters on COVID, like drawing analogies with COVID and climate change, because there's a lot of parallels and the differences are illuminating also. The issue was, you know, the strain of big pharma in all this. I mean, with Fauci, I think he was pushing remdesivir, yeah, you know, early on, you know, that this was the thing that everybody should take. And so any other natural remedy or repurposing of existing drugs. That was immediately dismissed and poo-pooed. Remdesivir was the ticket. Well, remdesivir turned out not to be effective and to have bad side effects. So, and this is what he was trying to push on everybody. The issue of vaccines, I took the 2 shots. I had Moderna, and then I had a booster in, I think, December of 2021. And I had a big issue with the booster. I mean, it messed up my immune system really bad. Staph infections, shingles, Epstein-Barr, everything was just coming back, on a time scale of 6 months. And of course, it was a vaccine. My body just didn't clear the vaccine, and I was stressing my immune system. So I was messed up for about 18 months after the second vaccine. No more mRNA vaccines for me. Thank you very much. But it's very hard to know what to do. But one thing I've learned is pay attention to the recommendations from Europe, not from the US. With the new variants and the new vaccine that's coming out, the EU is saying only for people 65 and older, the potential side effects and whatever, the cure is worse than the disease for younger people. But at the US, they're pushing it for people as young as 6 months old. And this is, just to make sure that Big Pharma gets enough income through all this. I mean, it's completely corrupt in terms of how this played out in terms of Big Pharma and the people like Fauci who are invested and earn money from these drugs. That's a total crazy conflict of interest. I can't imagine how that can happen, but it's there. I mean, Fauci was really invested in this remdesivir drug, for example. So it's just, the footprint. And I'm an atmospheric scientist. I understand how these things transmit. So once we knew that this was transmitted on aerosol particles, small particles in the atmosphere, it makes a lot of sense. Well, of course, people are fine outside. Closing down playgrounds and beaches and all this kind of stuff made absolutely no sense because the wind, mixes and dilutes everything up unless you're intensely packed in there. So that, it made everything much worse by closing down parks and playgrounds and golf courses and beaches. It made everything much worse. So many stupid decisions were made, even when this, basic science, not fancy science, but basic science about how aerosol particles move in the atmosphere. I mean, stuff that we've understand for many decades. It was just beyond craziness, where all these restrictions on outdoor activities made absolutely no sense.
Yeah, and you had folks like Dr. Brett Weinstein talking about early on, saying that UV rays killed COVID on contact. So restricting access to the beach was completely ludicrous. But again, these were things, and we saw this throughout the COVID era. Did you ever read RFK Jr.'s book on the real Anthony Fauci?
No, I haven't read that.
It's a great book. And when you see Dr. Fauci's handling of the AIDS epidemic in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and you see how he handled COVID, the similarities are striking. And once it's seen patterns, and once you see these things play out, it's just history repeating itself. And you always hear, it's good to learn from history so we don't repeat it, but yet we see it play it out over and over and over. And it's like, for whatever reason, we just never learn. And it's fascinating how this plays out, and it just seems like some people may chalk it up, and I don't know where you may stand, chalk it up to just incompetence, things like that. I
Well,
feel there's agendas at play.
Well, it's incompetence and it's a desire for control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really truly scary times where we're living at. A lot of it just seems on purpose to destroy the economy, destroy our way of life, and
Well, yeah, it's a degrowth agenda. I mean, this is
yeah,
very prevalent in the UN environmental program and the UN overall. You know, they like degrowth. They hate fossil fuel companies. They hate capitalism. And they're not fans of democracy either. They prefer, you know, non-governmental world control under the UN. You know, and that agenda is out there. And, you know, and the World Health Organization, who made so many bad calls, it's unbelievable. They're trying to get everybody to sign on to let the WHO mandate policies during COVID, which would be a complete disaster. Complete disaster. I mean, they have an agenda that goes way beyond health.
Yeah. In all these organizations, the World Economic Forum, the Club of Rome, they have the same agendas, and it seems like their goal is to infiltrate all these other countries. You see these measures being played out in every country, and that's what makes it scary. And then everything else gets tied in, whether it's the CBDCs, social credit systems get tied into this climate change. It's all interconnected. I don't know if you saw this article that came out, I guess in Singapore. It's now going to cost $106,000 just to have a permit to purchase a car. So, for example, if you were to buy a Toyota Camry in Singapore, the total amount with the permit and everything, it's $186,000 for a Toyota Camry. And so when you don't have any context, you're like, wow, that's insane. You know, only these elites are going to be able to buy cars and drive around in Singapore. But it's these 15-minute cities. These 15-minute cities, it used to be called a conspiracy theory, and now we're seeing it rolled out everywhere. And Singapore seems to be going that direction. So let's get rid of everyone with cars. If you have $200,000 to spend on a vehicle, then you can drive. But if you don't have that, you know, get on the public transit systems on your bikes. Everything's going green. We need to save the earth. And while we're at it, more surveillance measures and more control measures at the end of the day.
It's not a good thing.
It's not a good thing.
Well, I mean, in cities, I mean, the challenge is, I mean, I lived in Atlanta for a long time, and the traffic in Atlanta is insane.
Yes,
it makes
it is.
Absolutely no sense. I mean, how is this useful for anybody? So public transportation, work from home, better live, work, play neighborhoods, better urban design. I'm in favor of that kind of thing. I mean, in California is another place where, you know, it just, people spend half their life in a car driving from one place to another. I mean, the distances are large and tons of traffic. I mean, that makes no sense. That's no quality of life. So we need to rethink, you know, our cities. But we should, you know, but we would make it desirable where nobody would want a car. You don't make it impossible for people to have a car if they need one. You know, the problem, I think, I'm trying to figure out which city it was. Maybe New York, trying to, London. Okay, it's London. They already have, you know, to drive a car into London is extremely expensive. Okay. And in all honesty, in the city, there's no reason to drive a car. They have a great, subway system, transit system, and the air quality can get really bad in London. So I get why you don't want cars, but the problem is that people who live outside of London and work in London, London's a very expensive place to live, they want to be able to drive into London to go to work. And they're trying to extend this out now to the outer boroughs or whatever of London, to make that. And it doesn't make sense there because there's no dense transit system in these, outer kind of cities surrounding London. So, there's a lot of backlash on that, as there should be. But that said, it seems to be working for inner city London, where it's so dense, and cars, the traffic will not move, and the pollution gets really bad. So that there's trade-offs there, but you have to do things that make sense for workers who are trying to drive to work or get to work, and nobody seems to have thought about that. So these 15-minute cities, were okay for very constrained situations, but they don't work in general unless you have this peculiar situation where your entire workforce sort of lives within this zone, and that's a very rare situation.
Well, the concerning thing for me is that on paper, it's kind of like communism. It sounds great, these 15-minute cities, but I think my biggest reluctance to it is these social credit scores coming in. We're already going through a lot of censorship as it is. And what's going to happen? Yeah, what's going to happen when you have a dissenting opinion regarding this?
You want to design it. Okay, in Japan, people don't want a car because the public transportation is so good. You've got CEOs and politicians and everybody taking public transport. It's so good. So, if you make something that good, people are going to want to use it. On the other hand, if you try to take something away from people that they have and that they want, then that's wrong. But if something better comes along that displaces their current mode of transportation, well, then that could be a good thing. But you need the carrot, not the stick. If you're trying to change behavior, you need carrots, not the stick.
No, and I think most people are kind, and we have humanity. Unfortunately, it seems like time and time and again, we get ruled by these psychopaths that gravitate to the top and are implementing these controls. It's just people that, you've got someone like Hillary Clinton who laughed at the death of Muammar Gaddafi, a guy that was speaking out against things that they didn't want to hear, and she thought it was the most funniest thing. These are the kind of individuals that won't really have no humanity, and yet the overwhelming of us, we do have that human element where we have care and compassion and try to do the right thing. I think most of us fall in that category. It's just time and time and again, the people that gravitate to the top are the scumbags. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. That's something that I've tried to explore. I know we've only got a few more minutes, Dr. Judy. I wanted to ask you something that I like to ask a lot of guests when they come on. It's a simple question, but it's very profound. For you, Dr. Judy, what is truth?
It isn't. It's a social construct. It changes with time. It changes as our knowledge base increases. It's something that we seek, okay, but it's not something that engraved in stone, like, the Ten Commandments or whatever. It's something we seek. So, and knowledge is provisional. Our understanding is provisional. Things that, 200 years ago we thought were true turned out not to be true. And, and even in my little narrow field of climate dynamics research, there's new ideas, new discoveries, new ways of looking at things that are published every month. So does that mean the truth that we saw 2 months ago is no longer the truth? No. It's just that truth is something abstract and it's provisional. And it's something we seek. It's not something that we have or we know.
Wow, I love that. Very different from a very different answer. And that's why I like asking folks that very question, because it's always a different answer for different people. But that was a very unique answer, and it makes a lot of sense. It's one of those things that I'm constantly, and I say this all the time, I think in life, all of us, we go through life wanting to believe in as many true things as possible. And if there was some way to find out, maybe the Elon Musk brain chip will do this, but if there was some way to filter out what actual things are verifiably 100% true and what other stuff is just complete nonsense and baloney, what percentage would that be? Is it only 20% of what we know actually real and true? Or is it less than that? What is it?
Well, there's some genuine facts, of physics, of mathematics, and the hard sciences. There are some genuine facts there.
2 + 2 = 4.
Right. Yeah. Right. But when you're talking about complex systems, the environment, the human body, epidemiology, social sciences, then we're in the realm of complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity. And we just need to recognize that. And, people can look at evidence and think about it. But in these complex systems, people, 3 different people can look at the same evidence and come to different conclusions because they have different logical, a different logical framework for linking the pieces of evidence. So, it's no wonder that, there's disagreement. And this is a major theme of my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, is that we just need to, embrace the uncertainty monster, and acknowledge that there's, a lot of things that we're just not going to know for sure. And we need to figure out how to carry on and make good decisions based on information that's often incomplete or untrustworthy. And that's the only way we can move forward. But trying to portray certain things as incontrovertible, the UN climate alarmism, things like that. I mean, that's, people can choose to believe that or not. They can choose to investigate it on their own, or they can choose to ignore the whole thing and just get on with their lives. The facts that we need to live our lives aren't all that many when you get down to it. I mean, we pay our electricity bills. Many of us don't understand where our electric power comes from, or even understand the underlying basic physics of the whole thing, but they still plug something in and it turns on and they get on with their lives. So does it matter that they don't really understand where electricity comes from and how it works? So, how to think critically and evaluate evidence, and, honing your BS detector, these are, useful things for people to do, but people can survive with being very ignorant. They can survive in this society, and they can be very ignorant of how the world works. They can have all these crazy ideas, and, just the overall societal infrastructure that we have in an advanced economy is able to support a lot of really ignorant people, and willfully stupid even. So what is truth? Does it matter? At the end of the day, we don't need to know a lot of truths, in my opinion, in order to navigate whatever it is we need to navigate.
Wow, very, very unique answer, but it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because like I said, I mean, if we took our individual views and put it through some kind of filter and filter out the absolute truths, if there is such a thing, complete, as opposed to the complete nonsense, what would that percentage be? It'd be an interesting experiment.
Some people have greater knowledge base and more wisdom than others, so it'll vary. But if you look back 100 years ago, the things that we know now and take for granted weren't even dreamt of back then.
Yeah. And I mean, and you take those examples from history, and I mean, bloodletting through leeches was an acceptable thing. Lobotomies, as recently as 100 years ago, were completely acceptable. And so when you hear people like Dr. Fauci saying, I am the science, and you got to do this and you got to do that, you have to realize that, I got to do more homework. I got to do more research. And I don't know. I think we all have to travel our own journey. That was when I started seeing the nonsense. I don't have a degree. I'm just a garbage man. I'm not very educated. I love to consume books, but I'm just a regular Joe, I guess you can say. But when I saw the patterns in my own hometown, I'm like, none of this is making sense. I was like, and I don't like how this is being coerced upon us, this shot. I'm going to lose my job. Well, shit, I'm going to get a different job. I don't want it. If you're pushing it that hard, I'm staying away from it. And so that, that's what I did. And it's just about analyzing and paying attention. And also just don't rely on confirmation bias. Look at the other side. Because it could be that you may be believing or following down a path that is completely wrong and false. And unless you explore these other sides, so you're not in an echo chamber, I think that'll get you eventually closer to truth. This is why now that
I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, now that I'm 41.
Challenge the evidence, challenge your assumptions, question your conclusions. I mean, this is really a better path to understanding, eventually to truth.
100%. I won't take much more of your time, Dr. Jude. I truly enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.
You are a gem. You are a whistleblower. And it's a shame that you. But again, we're living during cancel time, so I mean, I would take it as a badge of honor.
I think my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, is in some ways a philosophy of knowledge, of understanding risk, understanding what we know, what we don't know, what we can't know, and how do we make decisions, in this context.
Right.
So, and
that's your third book, right?
Yeah, it's my third book. The others were more textbooks. I think, this one is really for a broader audience.
Okay. And where would you want people to purchase this, on your
Well,
website or?
Well, Amazon.com, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, by Judith Curry. Check it out.
I have
Yeah,
your website and I have your Twitter, but I'll definitely put a link to the Amazon book there as well.
sure. I would
Yeah,
appreciate that.
for sure. Yeah, no, thank you so much. Truly enjoyed this, and you are a wealth of knowledge. I can't thank you enough for
Thank
joining me
you.
today.
Yeah, I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Judy. I hope you have a great weekend, and looking forward to finishing your book. So I'm a few chapters in, and I will definitely be finishing it.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to your feedback.
All righty. Thank you.